Today, the building that is most closely associated with Roman civilization is without a doubt the Colosseum. But the Flavian Amphitheater, as it was then known, was a relatively late addition to the city. It wasn't completed until 72 AD, well after the full collapse of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire, and it enjoyed only a few centuries of use before the games ended for good in the 6th century. As magnificent as the Colosseum was, and is, the building that perhaps best exemplifies the might of Rome is not an architectural masterwork, but rather a relatively unknown, and now almost fully destroyed, temple in the Forum that sat at the intersection of Roman commerce, militarism, religion, and government for centuries. The decisions made here affected the lives of tens of millions of people, often for the worse. The temple, built to honor the twin gods Castor and Pollux, is one of the oldest cult buildings in the Roman Forum. As the primary temple for the patron deities of Rome's wealthy equestrian order and a frequent meeting place for the Senate, the temple united Rome's two most dominant classes, the entrepreneurial equestrians and the politically powerful senators. For some idea of how this building operated in the Roman Republic era, imagine if America's Congress and Wall Street bankers did their business out of the same building. Actually, I guess that's not so hard to imagine. Uniting the military, political, economic, and religious spheres of the ancient Romans, the Temple of Castor and Pollux was, more than any other building, an expression of the animating spirit of Romanness, and of the ideological superstructure which permitted and even encouraged Romans to engage in conquest and exploitation on a scale unprecedented in its efficiency and its cruelty. The Temple of Castor and Pollux is an apt poetic representation of the complicated identity of ancient Rome, and as we will argue, it should come as no great surprise that this most Roman of buildings was home to some of the most significant armed clashes that occurred in the Republic's dying days. The temple was in use by Romans in some capacity for more than 1,000 years, encompassing the era of the Republic as well as the early and late Empire. Though its role in the political, economic, and religious life of Rome would vary over the centuries, it was genuinely central to Roman life for some 800 years, the length of time between its foundation and the official adoption of Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire. Unsurprisingly, as its official functions evolved and its ideological grounding shifted, the building itself was expanded and renovated accordingly, reflecting its changing role in Roman society. The version of the Temple of Castor and Pollux that partially survives today was erected in the final decade of the 1st century BC, replacing an earlier temple likewise dedicated to the twin sons of Jupiter, which had stood on the site since 484 BC. The original temple had been dedicated by the general Aulus Postumius after the Roman victory over the Latins in the Battle of Lake Regillus. During the battle, 2 young men riding white horses were said to have appeared and guided the Romans to victory. And then these same 2 mysterious figures were seen again after the battle, watering their horses at the Juturna Spring in Rome. Thus, the temple was dedicated to the famous twin divine horsemen and built next to the fountain. However, the veneration of Castor and Pollux long predates the Romans' temple in their honor. The Hellenistic cult initially spread to Italy through the influence of the Greek colonies scattered across the southern half of the peninsula. According to the myths, Castor and Pollux were the twin demigod offspring of Jupiter and Leda. Both gods were renowned as excellent horsemen and hunters. The temple hosted one of Rome's premier annual events. A cavalry parade known as the Transvectio was held every July 15th to commemorate the victory at Lake Regillus and the twins' alleged supernatural intervention. The parade was led by 2 young men on white horses representing Castor and Pollux and included up to 5,000 horsemen who carried spears and shields and wore purple robes and olive wreaths. With its central location, the temple always played a key role in the events of the Forum and, by extension, the Roman state as a whole. Because the equestrians, Rome's established businessmen, were dominant here, the Senate did not exert the same control over meetings at the Temple of Castor and Pollux that it did at other Senate meeting places, such as the Curia and the Comitium. This made it the location from which senators often tried to earn popular backing for their proposals. And by the late Republic, it was a given that any meeting here would be accompanied by a raucous crowd. The temple also served as an office of weights and measures, and as a treasury for the money of private individuals, as well as to the state. But while its political significance was critical, the temple was, above all else, a site of commerce. There were countless temples in the city, and pragmatic zeal for money-making was the real god that Romans worshipped most in practice, not any borrowed Greek deity. Plus, the Senate was not always in session and could, depending upon the circumstances, meet at a number of venues. But the Temple of Castor and Pollux was always bustling with Romans looking to climb a little higher on the socio-economic ladder. The base of the temple contained dozens of stalls that were rented out to equestrian entrepreneurs. Because the rent in the center of the forum was high, it should come as little surprise that the business conducted there was often of the most lucrative, and therefore unsavory, sort, with high-interest money lending and slave trading being particularly popular choices. As a popular meeting location for the Senate, it is fitting that the temple proudly displayed the brutally won riches from the far reaches of Rome's empire. Imagine, for example, dozens of terrified people, condemned to a life of enslavement, crowded together, bodies daubed in chalk which confirmed that they could be purchased by anyone and forced to do anything. It's hard to imagine the pain of these men, women, and children from across the empire's conquered territories as they stood in the middle of the forum, nude and profoundly vulnerable, for sale to the highest bidder. But foreign slaves were not the only thing on sale at the temple. It was also where equestrians would place bids on valuable government contracts, including the right to gather taxes in the provinces. Here, they would, in effect, compete over who would be able to most thoroughly and systematically exploit provincials. The publicani contractors who won the contracts committed to bringing in the total bid amount, but they could, and did, pocket any additional revenue for themselves. They often made their fortunes by saddling the empire's poor, rural populations with obscene tax burdens, a practice that made tax collectors tremendously unpopular in occupied territories, as anyone who has read the New Testament accounts of life in first-century Palestine will know. This concentration of economic activity made the temple a major seat of power for the equestrian business class. Influential equestrians were always on hand to lobby passing senators to forgive the debts of tax collectors or send legions out to punish areas that were behind on payment. Befitting its role at the heart of the Roman state and economy, the temple was also the focal point for protests, and as the foundations of the Republic faltered, it was witness to growing violence. Once, during the chaos of the social war, a praetor who'd sought to revive an ancient law against usury was preparing to make a routine sacrifice at the temple. But a tribune, backed by the aristocratic optimates, raised an arm as if to veto the sacrifice. The praetor was startled. Then, as if on cue, a mob stormed toward the praetor, who dropped his sacred implements and fled into one of the temple's shops. In the ensuing chaos, the praetor's body was discovered, but the person that slit his throat was never identified. The temple was also the site of several violent confrontations during the late Republic, including a fracas that occurred in 62 BC, when Caesar, as praetor, attempted to recall Pompey from the east, a move which was resisted by Cato and his fellow optimate tribunes. Plutarch quotes Cato as saying that the scuffle amounted to, quote, a revolutionary movement set on foot by the poor classes whose hopes were fixed on Caesar, end quote. Though already staunch foes, this incident permanently cemented the enmity between these two leading political figures of the late Republic, Caesar, the firebrand populist, and Cato, the arch-conservative optimate. But this was merely a preview of things to come just a few years later during Caesar's consulship. Caesar's signature legislative proposal was a land bill to help settle the urban poor and Pompey's veterans, though Plutarch, for one, characterized the bill as, quote, moderate and carefully reasoned, end quote. Cato and the Optimates walked out of the Senate en masse to prevent it being heard. Because it was only tradition, not requirement, that the Senate consent to this legislation, Caesar responded by taking the bill to the Centuriate Assembly, a more friendly audience which was largely made up of ex-soldiers. To ensure passage, large numbers of Pompey's veterans came to Rome to participate in the expected vote. Caesar's co-consul was a conservative named Bibulus, a man who was vehemently opposed to any measures that would improve the lot of Rome's poor. He flouted the will of the people with characteristic aristocratic contempt, openly telling them that he did not care what they wanted, and brought forward 3 conservative tribunes of the plebs who would veto the passage of the bill. Likely expecting a veto from one of these Optimate-aligned tribunes, Caesar played his trump card. His enormously powerful, sometimes allies, Pompey and Crassus, both came forward in support of the bill, convincing the tribunes to rescind their vetoes. Bibulus responded by declaring that, due to inauspicious signs from the heavens, all public business needed to cease at once. He ordered the vote suspended for religious reasons. But Caesar, who was also Pontifex Maximus, the highest religious authority in Rome, simply ignored Bibulus and continued with the vote. This was a severe breach of protocol. The Optimates had long used religious regulations as a failsafe to maintain their control over the Roman state, and Caesar's bold defiance of their religious objections prompted Bibulus and his allies to mount the steps of the temple of Castor and Pollux and attempt to speak out against the bill. But the angry crowd gathered in front of the temple would hear none of it and assaulted the consul and his entourage, even breaking the fasces that symbolized his legal imperium. Adding insult to injury, feces were poured upon his head. Getting up, Bibulus uncovered his neck and shouted to the crowd to kill him and end his embarrassment. His fellow senators persuaded him to leave and regroup at a nearby temple, but as he did, the Centuriate Assembly proceeded to pass Caesar's bill. After this humiliation, Bibulus stopped attending meetings of the Senate altogether. He stayed in his house for the remainder of the year, effectively ceding complete control over the consulship. For the rest of the year, the people of Rome mocked Bibulus by declaring that the 2 consuls were really Julius and Caesar. As the republican institutions decayed even further, the temple was the site of still more clashes. In 59 BC, the tribune Claudius, a fervent populist in the mold of the Gracchi brothers, went so far as to forcefully occupy the temple during his year in office. He boldly struck out at the heart of the political order, removing the temple's steps to turn it into a makeshift fortress in the middle of the city. His actions ground political and economic activity to a halt, while Claudius proclaimed that the Roman people alone exercised sovereignty within the city. The occupied temple was used as a recruiting station for the collegia aligned with the popularis cause, as Claudius organized underworld captains and urban laborers alongside the unemployed freeborn, freedmen, and even slaves into a new web of unprecedented political associations designed to break the power of the Optimates forever. Claudius's actions were radical and bold, but, needless to say, earned him a lot of powerful enemies. He would be assassinated within the decade. During the Principate, Augustus jumped at the chance to restore the temple after a fire, and, in a characteristic move, he used this occasion to bring the worship of Castor and Pollux into the official imperial cult, with a new feast day for the demigods on the 27th of January. Augustus was adept at using religion to propagandize the urban plebs whose support he had inherited from Caesar, as he always found making religious overtures easier to abide than delivering the actual material benefits his adopted father was willing to confer. As he used the restoration of religion and traditional values to justify the emerging Principate, Augustus also sought to associate his own 2 grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, with the mythical heroes of Lake Regillus and their temple. The Roman people would be quick to make the connection that if these boys were indeed Castor and Pollux, then Augustus himself could be none other than Jupiter. However, both children were to die before completion of the project, and so were substituted for the new heir apparent, Tiberius and his brother Drusus in 6 AD. As emperor, Tiberius was also responsible for the final restorations to the temple. The temple begins to fall out of the historical record by the 4th century, when the conversion of the empire to Christianity would have seen it closed. Unlike other prominent temples, we have no evidence that the temple was ever turned into a church. In fact, the temple may have fallen into disrepair before this, as 4th century records indicate that the sacred spring at which Castor and Pollux supposedly appeared 800 years prior was walled off with reused material. Nothing is known of its subsequent history, except that in the 15th century, only 3 columns of its original structure were still standing, earning the street running by the building the name Via Trium Columnarum. Though the loss of ancient Rome is a tragedy, the Temple of Castor and Pollux probably did more than any other building in history to earn its destruction. It was a meeting house for a senate dedicated to exploitation of the poor. It was a nerve center of military expansion and a slave market where the human plunder of imperial conquest was sold without compunction. It's hard to mourn too keenly the loss of such a place.
Gaius here. Thanks for being part of our efforts to shed light on the more obscure topics related to the fascinating world of the ancient Romans. If you enjoyed Titus's work here, please do us a favor by liking and subscribing. Gratias vobis ago.